Hello, y'all, and welcome back. So, in the Republic, we are addressing the question, why be good? What's the point of being a good person? Is it valuable to be a good person in any way, apart from rewards for being good, consequences for doing the wrong thing, or should you just be good if it helps the bottom line? Now, this question itself is clearly going to depend on how you understand or define good in a person. What does that even mean, to be good? What state of soul does that constitute? And here we immediately run up against a very substantial obstacle, which is that good in a person is surprisingly difficult to determine. And I say surprisingly difficult because it's not hard to determine whether somebody is good in other areas of life. So I'm going to take out the most controversial example I can think of, but I like this example because it's just so stark and plain and obvious, and it is the most controversial American, Donald Trump, who's been in the public eye extraordinarily for, my whole lifetime, but like politically 10 years at least as I record this, okay? Now, half the country thinks this guy is great, like he's this savior figure. They really love him. And half the country thinks he's awful, like this horrible human being, the worst thing to happen to American politics and American society. And it's fascinating to me that there's such sharp disagreement on this person, on is he a good person, this question. Because if we wanted to answer the question, is he a good blank in any other area, it would be really easy to tell, and there would be almost universal agreement, right? So is he a good basketball player? Well, give him a basketball, put him on the court. In about 90 seconds, there'd be universal agreement on whether he is or not. Is he a good archer? Is he a good equestrian? Is he a good, you get the idea. Not maybe every area, but just about every area. So why is it so hard to tell, is he a good person? Why is there such massive disagreement here? Social and political elements aside, this question is not unique to this person. It affects all of us when we're trying to determine character in many different people. I myself, I'm probably alone in this, but I've had the experience of thinking that somebody was really good, trusting them, and realizing too late that they were not. Okay? I'm sure you haven't had that experience, but I've had it. Hopefully it's at least somewhat relatable. Okay, why do we do this? Because it's hard to tell someone's character. Why is it hard to tell? Plato's theory, his answer to this question, a little unusual, but he says it's hard to tell because good in a person is small. We are small creatures, and looking at our soul, there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of detail, and as we kind of look into the soul to determine goodness or badness, it's hard to see. There's just too much going on, a lot of detail. So Plato says, how do we get clarity on what good in a person is? On how do we understand this? He says, here's my strategy. It's unconventional, it's a little strange, but stick with me. Two kinds of things are called good or just. Now, Plato's going to be operating with the term just. I'm going to alternate between this and the term good for my own pedagogical purposes. But he says, two kinds of things are called good and just. People, obviously. The other is political entities or states. Now, Plato's obviously, and the people in the Republic that are talking, they're obviously thinking about city-states, these Greek polis, but we can think, perhaps most useful for our purposes, of just countries, right? So the idea is that there's disagreement on which people are good people, but there is substantially less disagreement on which states, which political entities, are just and unjust. So you take just a country in Western Europe, like Germany, right? Is Germany perfect? By no means. But it's a just society, by and large, right? People have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. People are trying to move there. I've been to Germany plenty of times. It's fine. By contrast, you take an unjust state like North Korea, where people are tortured and killed and starving and desperate to get out and have no freedom of any kind. And it's pretty obvious that's an unjust state. Will you get universal agreement on this question? Of course not. But you don't get universal agreement on basic arithmetic. Right? So there's disagreement a lot more in the question or in the area of, is this human being just or unjust? And much more substantial agreement on, is this state just or unjust? And Plato says, we all know this. Why is this? He says it's because states are bigger. They're bigger. It's just easier to see the moving parts, the things that constitute goodness or justice in a state. So he says, here's my strategy. Well, let's figure out what justice or goodness in a state is. Let's get a nice clear definition of that. And since the only other thing that's called just or good morally is a human being, maybe the same definition of justice that applies to a state is going to apply to a human being. So then we'll have a nice definition of justice for human beings. And once we have that, we can tell, well, is that good just in and of itself, or is it only good for rewards and consequences? That's the strategy. I know that sounds a little unconventional, a little strange, but that's the whole idea of Plato's Republic. He gets then into an enormous amount of political philosophy, which I would really like to get into myself, but would take multiple modules, and there's a lot we have to cover. So I'll have to summarize it by saying that at the end of his excursus into political philosophy, the conclusion he comes to is that justice in a state is each of three parts doing its own work. Each of three parts doing its own work. So very quickly, the three parts are the rulers who make the laws, the ordinary folks, the money makers, whose role is just to obey the laws, and then an intermediate class called the auxiliaries who enforce the laws. Very, very quick. So we have a definition of justice, which is incredible. I mean, that's really what we're after, right? Each of three parts doing its own work. Now, does this same definition apply to human beings? If it does, we've got most of what we're looking for. Well, clearly it applies if and only if human beings have three parts. The reference here obviously is not to our body, which has indefinitely many parts, but to our soul. You as a person, without reference to your body, does that have three parts? So does the soul have three parts? What a weird question. How would you even begin to answer a question like that? And Plato understands that that's a strange question. He says, okay, here's how we should think about this. We can all agree that as people, psychologically, we have a few basic tendencies. He says, let's delineate three basic tendencies. No doubt there's many more, but we'll say that they all fall into they all fall in some way into one of these three broad categories. The first is what we'll call reason. Reason thinks, plans, and calculates. So it's the part of you that you're exercising now as you're engaging philosophy content, when you plan your day, when you set goals. That's the idea. That's reason. The second is spirit. Spirit feels beauty, feels emotion, moral feeling, pride of any kind. Spirit feels. And the third part is appetite, which desires food, drink, and sex. Now, appetite almost certainly desires other things too. Anything you can buy with money, probably. Entertainment, at least in the variety of kind of like scrolling and, hits of dopamine. If the entertainment is like real aesthetic pleasure, like a concert or something, it probably would be more spirit. So just to kind of avoid all gray areas, let's say appetite desires food, drink, sex, and related pleasures. Three areas. Reason, spirit, and appetite. Now, these are three psychological tendencies. Are these parts of the soul? If they are, we're well on our way to finding what we want to find, which is that does the definition of justice that applies to a state applies to a person? Well, that's going to be the $64,000 question. We'll get into that in the next video. Thanks.